Breaking, one phone call changed everything. Minutes ago, he was a boardroom king, confident, powerful, untouchable. The CEO stepped out of his luxury office, smiling at success, when police suddenly surrounded him. Handcuffs clicked, cameras flashed. The shock? His ex-girlfriend had set him up, leaking secrets and evidence he never saw coming. In seconds, his empire collapsed. From private jets to police custody, his rise ended in betrayal, proving that sometimes the biggest danger isn't business rivals. It's the one who knows your past. Dominic Kane was a man who commanded attention the moment he entered a room. At 6'2", with sharp jawline, piercing gray eyes, and a presence that seemed to bend space around him, he exuded authority the way others exuded charm. By the age of 35, Dominic had built Kane Industries into a multinational empire, dominating the tech sector with a combination of strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency. He had always been ambitious, a man who thrived on risk and reward, and the corporate world had recognized his talent. Boardrooms became his arenas, mergers and acquisitions his battlefields. Every move he made seemed calculated, every glance measured. To investors and rivals alike, Dominic was untouchable, the epitome of power and control. Despite his public persona of the calculated CEO, Dominic's personal life was a labyrinth of secrets, indulgences, and carefully hidden vulnerabilities. He had charisma, certainly, but it came with an edge of danger, a sense that anyone who got too close might get burned. Among the many people who had fallen under his influence, one stood out: Vanessa Reed. She was beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious, a woman who had clawed her way into the elite circles of society. Dominic had met her at a gala 5 years prior, and their chemistry had been immediate and explosive. Vanessa had a mind that matched his own. She could anticipate his moves, challenge his authority, and yet, somehow, always left him wanting more. For a time, they were the ultimate power couple, attending the world's most exclusive events, gracing the covers of magazines, and making headlines wherever they went. But beneath the glossy surface of high society, tensions brewed. Dominic's world was one of constant calculation, and while he thrived on control, Vanessa harbored her own ambitions that were not always aligned with his. She had eyes on power, not just love, and she knew the value of patience and timing. In those early years, Dominic thought himself immune to betrayal. He had faced corporate adversaries, legal threats, and financial crises. Yet nothing in his meticulously structured life had prepared him for the kind of deception that would come from someone who once claimed to love him. On a crisp Monday morning, the skyline of the city glittered as the sun reflected off the glass towers that dominated the financial district. Dominic arrived at the headquarters of Kane Industries, his limousine gliding smoothly past bustling streets. Inside, the boardroom was already humming with activity. Executives whispered among themselves. Reports were spread across polished oak tables, and the soft hum of digital devices filled the air. Dominic entered, and as always, the room fell silent. He scanned the faces before him, a practiced smile on his lips, a mind already calculating the next series of moves. Today was crucial. An important acquisition was on the table, a deal that could cement Kane Industries' dominance for the next decade. He began the meeting with his signature precision, articulating strategies, countering objections, and predicting market responses with near uncanny accuracy. His team responded in kind, bouncing ideas off one another, knowing that Dominic would dissect each suggestion with surgical scrutiny. Hours passed like minutes. As the meeting drew to a close, Dominic felt a familiar surge of satisfaction. He was at the apex of his game, untouchable, the king of a kingdom he had built from scratch. Yet, power has a way of masking vulnerability. Dominic's focus on his empire had left gaps in his personal life, gaps that Vanessa had been watching keenly. She had spent the past few months quietly gathering information, consulting lawyers, and positioning herself to strike when the timing was perfect. In the past, he would have never believed someone so close could orchestrate his downfall. But betrayal has a subtle rhythm. It is patient, and it often comes from the place you least suspect. As Dominic left the boardroom, he checked his phone. A message from Vanessa popped up, a simple, seemingly innocuous text. "Can we meet tonight? I have something important to discuss." Dominic paused. He had a habit of underestimating the personal risks in his life, always prioritizing business. He typed a quick reply. Sure. Dinner at 8. He didn't sense the storm that was quietly gathering, the trap being set with meticulous care. The evening arrived, and the city's skyline transformed into a sea of lights, reflecting the wealth and luxury that Dominic had cultivated. Vanessa's apartment was in one of the city's most exclusive buildings, with a panoramic view of the harbor. As he entered, he was greeted with her familiar charm, a smile that had once melted his defenses. The apartment was impeccably styled, modern, minimalist, and subtly opulent. Vanessa poured him a glass of wine, and they sat, the air thick with anticipation. Dominic, Vanessa began, her voice calm but edged with something he couldn't quite place. I've been thinking a lot about us, about what's next. Her words were deliberate, calculated, each syllable measured. Dominic leaned back, intrigued but cautious. He had always been able to read people, to anticipate moves, yet tonight, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, a charged energy that he couldn't immediately decipher. As the evening unfolded, Vanessa spoke of past grievances, minor slights that Dominic had barely noticed but which, in her eyes, represented deeper betrayals. Dominic listened, perplexed. The narrative she painted was convincing, carefully constructed, designed to evoke guilt, doubt, and ultimately distraction. He tried to steer the conversation toward reconciliation, toward logic, but Vanessa had already anticipated his responses, countering each argument with a precision that mirrored his own strategic thinking. Hours passed, and the city outside seemed oblivious to the storm brewing within the apartment. Vanessa's demeanor shifted subtly. She introduced topics that Dominic would later realize were traps: financial transactions, board decisions, and confidential documents that she had obtained through careful maneuvering. Every detail she revealed was designed to destabilize him, to make him question the solidity of his empire. And Dominic, caught between disbelief and trust, failed to notice the threads of betrayal weaving around him like an invisible net. By the time dinner concluded, Dominic felt a mixture of relief and unease. He had navigated Vanessa's words carefully, thinking he had emerged unscathed. But the truth was far more insidious. Vanessa's plan had been months in the making. She had aligned herself with external forces, lawyers, and even regulatory bodies, all while maintaining the facade of a devoted partner. Dominic's very success, the empire he had spent years building, was about to be weaponized against him, and he had no idea. The night ended with a polite farewell. Dominic left the apartment with a sense of cautious optimism, unaware that the seeds of his downfall had already been planted. As he entered his sleek black car, the city lights reflected in the polished surfaces, creating illusions of continuity, stability, and control, illusions that would soon shatter in an instant. Back at his penthouse, Dominic reviewed reports and emails, meticulously planning the week ahead. The phone rang, but he ignored it, lost in the comfort of his routines, the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. He did not notice the subtle vibrations of inevitability, the way fate often arrives disguised as a mundane moment. In the early hours, as the city slept beneath him, a quiet tension built, a tension that would explode into chaos, dragging Dominic from the heights of power into the depths of scandal, humiliation, and legal jeopardy. And then, the first shockwaves hit. A late-night email, marked urgent, appeared in his inbox. The subject line was cryptic but alarming. Immediate action required. Legal notification. Dominic frowned. His instinct was to dismiss it, to treat it as a bureaucratic inconvenience, but something in the phrasing, a subtle undertone of menace, prompted him to read further. What he saw made his blood run cold. The email contained formal allegations of financial misconduct, backed by documents, timestamps, and signatures that were disturbingly authentic. Dominic's mind raced. He had faced crises before, but nothing like this. The documents referenced transactions he had authorized, yet there were discrepancies that painted him as reckless, unethical, even criminal. He called his legal team immediately, demanding explanations, assurances, anything to disprove the mounting evidence. But the response was chilling in its calmness. Sir, these documents are authentic. We'll need to investigate further. But the regulators are already aware. Panic. a sensation Dominic had long prided himself on controlling, began to seep in. His empire, built on years of hard work, reputation, and strategic mastery, was suddenly vulnerable. The careful architecture of his life seemed to crumble under the weight of unseen forces. And the realization that Vanessa, the woman he had trusted above all, was at the center of the storm hit him with staggering force. She had leveraged intimacy for destruction, turning knowledge of his routines, habits, and trust into the ultimate weapon. By dawn, Dominic's world had shifted. The penthouse that once symbolized triumph now felt like a gilded cage. Every detail, every luxury seemed to mock him. Outside, the city continued, oblivious to the personal catastrophe unfolding at its apex. Dominic Kane, the boardroom king, the untouchable CEO, was facing a betrayal that could not be bargained with, negotiated away, or charmingly sidestepped. The battle ahead would not be fought in boardrooms, but in courtrooms, in public perception, in the harsh glare of a world suddenly aware of his vulnerabilities. As Section 1 closes, Dominic Kane stands at the precipice. The apex of power, the embodiment of control, has been compromised, and the world he knows, the empire he has meticulously built, is poised to collapse, triggered by the cunning and calculated betrayal of someone he once loved. The descent from king to accused, from revered to reviled, is about to begin, a descent that will unfold with shocking speed, leaving chaos, scandal, and heartbreak in its wake. Dominic Kane had always believed in control of his company, control of his life, control of the perception others had of him. But on that fateful morning, control slipped like sand through his fingers, invisible yet undeniable. The email he had received in the dead of night was only the first wave of a tsunami that would soon engulf him. He stared at the screen, heart pounding, fingers trembling slightly as he scrolled through the documents, each line more damning than the last. Numbers and signatures, dates and transactions, all perfectly aligned to paint a portrait of financial recklessness and deliberate deception. It was as if someone had rewritten reality, crafting evidence so precise that it left no room for doubt. Dominic's mind raced. He had faced boardroom crises before, from hostile takeovers to insider sabotage, but this felt different. This was intimate, personal. The cunning behind these allegations suggested an intimate knowledge of his habits, his schedules, and his vulnerabilities. His first instinct was disbelief. "It can't be Vanessa," he muttered aloud. She couldn't. But the gnawing unease in his chest whispered otherwise. Trust, he realized too late, had become the weapon against him. The first call was to his legal counsel, a sharp, efficient attorney named Marcus Delaney, who had helped Dominic navigate crises before. Marcus's voice, calm but edged with concern, did little to comfort him. "Dominic, these documents are solid. We'll need to respond immediately, but regulators are moving faster than we anticipated. If they decide to act, it could be public, very public." Dominic ran a hand over his face, trying to steady himself. The idea that his carefully curated image could crumble overnight was horrifying. Kane Industries was more than a company. It was a symbol of his intellect, his ambition, his dominance. Losing control of it, or worse, losing the respect of the world, was a thought he had never entertained seriously. Yet now, it loomed over him like a storm cloud, dark and inevitable. Meanwhile, Vanessa was already executing the next stage of her plan. She had ensured that Dominic's closest allies were subtly distanced, either through carefully timed misunderstandings or by directly feeding misinformation. At a glance, everything seemed normal. Meetings proceeded, emails were answered, but behind the scenes, she had orchestrated meticulous isolation. Dominic, focused on the emails and the legal counsel, failed to notice the subtle shift in his own circle. Trusted executives hesitated before offering opinions. Confidants seemed distracted or distant. The network of loyalty that had once surrounded him like armor was now a fragile web, vulnerable to rupture. By mid-morning, Dominic was summoned to a meeting he had not anticipated, a private session with the company's board of directors. The invitation was terse, professional, but the subtext was unmistakable. As he entered the boardroom, he felt a cold unease, the kind that prickles the skin when danger is near but unseen. The room was filled with familiar faces, board members who had once nodded at his every decision, But now their expressions were neutral, unreadable, and distant. Marcus, seated beside Dominic, whispered a warning. "They've been briefed. Be careful what you say." Dominic nodded, though the words did little to calm him. The meeting began with a polite, almost ceremonial introduction by the board chair, who commended Dominic for his years of leadership. But the atmosphere was heavy with tension, and within minutes, the discussion pivoted sharply. Regulators had requested an urgent review of company transactions. Dominic was asked to explain certain investments, certain approvals, certain transfers, all of which had been perfectly legal and meticulously documented, yet now appeared questionable under the lens of Vanessa's calculated machinations. He presented the facts as clearly as he could, walking through each transaction, explaining the rationale, the approvals, and the oversight. But the more he spoke, the more he sensed the subtle undermining around him. Questions were asked in tones that suggested doubt. Concerns were raised with pointed specificity, and whispers exchanged between board members added to the suffocating pressure. Dominic felt a creeping realization. He was being cornered not by accident, but by design. After what felt like an eternity, the boardroom cleared, leaving Dominic and Marcus alone. Dominic's hands shook as he gathered his notes. How did Vanessa get all this?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Marcus's expression was grim. "Someone close, someone with access. She's been feeding information. And Dominic, if the regulators move next, they won't be gentle. You need a strategy, fast." Back in his office, Dominic sat at the massive mahogany desk, staring blankly at the skyline beyond. The city shimmered, oblivious to the collapse of one of its most powerful figures. The empire he had built from nothing was teetering on the edge, and for the first time in his life, he felt the paralyzing weight of helplessness. He realized that the world he had mastered so thoroughly, the boardrooms, the media, the investors, was now an arena where he was entirely exposed. Hours later, the personal betrayal hit even harder. Vanessa called. Her voice, calm and measured, carried no hint of remorse. "Dominic, I'm sorry it had to come this way," she said, "but you left me no choice. You always prioritize your empire over us, over me. I just leveled the playing field." Dominic felt a surge of anger, a mix of disbelief and fury. "Vanessa, what are you talking about?" "You'll see soon enough," she replied, her tone icy. "Everything is already in motion." She hung up before he could respond, leaving him staring at the phone, the reality sinking in like a stone in deep water. Within the next 24 hours, the media caught wind of the developing scandal. Dominic's carefully maintained public image, once untouchable, was shredded by headlines that hinted at financial misconduct, insider dealings, and betrayal at the highest levels of corporate leadership. Social media erupted. Investors began questioning their positions. Analysts speculated. Rumors spread. And Dominic found himself in a whirlwind of chaos, unable to stem the tide. He called emergency meetings, desperate to regain some semblance of control, but every move was countered by the invisible hand of Vanessa's plan. Documents were leaked selectively, carefully, in ways that undermined his credibility. Trusted executives, now fearful of being implicated, followed protocol over loyalty. Dominic was watching, powerless, as the foundation of his life. His empire, his reputation, his identity, began to crumble piece by piece. Then the ultimate blow came. A legal notice arrived, delivered to his office in person. The document was official, stamped and signed, and it outlined formal charges that could lead to criminal prosecution. Dominic, who had always considered himself untouchable, read the words over and over, unable to comprehend the transformation of his life in mere hours. The allegations were severe: embezzlement, financial misrepresentation, corporate fraud. And while some might have been disputable, the evidence Vanessa had orchestrated left little room for defense. Dominic Kane, the boardroom king, the man who had never lost a negotiation, who had weathered hostile takeovers and market crashes with precision and cunning, was now facing legal peril. The news spread quickly. Staff members who once revered him whispered in corners. Media vans began parking outside the headquarters. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered questions through the glass doors, and Dominic felt the world watching, judging, waiting for his inevitable fall. Amidst this chaos, Dominic's personal life unraveled as well. Friends and confidants, unsure whom to trust, kept their distance. Family members called cautiously, voices tinged with concern and fear. Vanessa's betrayal was not just financial and professional. It was intimate, personal, and it cut deeper than any corporate failure could. Dominic realized with a sinking feeling that this was not just a scandal. It was a total dismantling of everything he had built, executed with surgical precision by someone he had loved and trusted implicitly. As night fell, Dominic sat alone in the dim light of his office, reviewing the documents once more, trying to find a flaw, a loophole, a shred of hope. But every angle he examined confirmed the terrifying reality. Vanessa had orchestrated an operation that left him exposed, vulnerable, and on the brink of disaster. For the first time, Dominic Kane felt fear. Not the fear of failure, but the fear of betrayal so profound that it threatened to destroy the very core of who he was. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closing, heart pounding. In his mind, the boardroom battles he had always won, the negotiations, the acquisitions, the victories, they seemed trivial compared to the avalanche descending upon him. This was a new kind of battlefield, one where weapons were trust, deception, and manipulation. And Dominic, the master of strategy, had been outmaneuvered, trapped by someone who knew him better than anyone else in the world. By the end of the second day, Dominic Kane's world had changed irrevocably. The empire he had ruled with an iron grip was under scrutiny. The press, regulators, and even his closest associates were circling. And Vanessa, the architect of his downfall, remained hidden behind a veil of innocence and calculated charm. The stage was set for what would become a public spectacle of betrayal, humiliation, and a precipitous fall of a man who had once been untouchable. Dominic Kane had always believed that wealth and influence could shield him from almost anything. Boardroom crises, hostile takeovers, legal investigations. He had faced them all with a combination of intellect, charm, and audacity. But now, the unthinkable was happening. The meticulously constructed world of Kane Industries, the empire he had spent years building, was collapsing faster than he could comprehend. The storm that Vanessa had orchestrated was no longer just whispers in the shadows. It reached the full glare of public scrutiny, legal enforcement, and media frenzy. The morning began with a flurry of calls and messages, some from panicked investors, others from anxious employees, and a few from news outlets that had somehow obtained details of the scandal. Dominic's phone rang incessantly, but he barely had the mental bandwidth to answer. His hands shook as he scrolled through headlines online. Kane Industries CEO under investigation. Allegations of fraud and embezzlement emerge. From billionaire mogul to alleged criminal. The sudden fall of Dominic Kane. Was the boardroom king set up? Inside the betrayal that shocked the city. Each headline stabbed at him. A sharp reminder of the empire he had nurtured now being dismantled publicly. Dominic's first instinct was to regain control. He called his legal team, demanding strategy, reassurances, anything to stop the slide. But even Marcus, his trusted attorney, seemed unsettled. Dominic, Marcus said cautiously, "It's worse than we thought. The documents are airtight. Regulators are already involved, and the police have been alerted. This isn't just corporate. It's criminal now. If they decide to act, you could be detained today." The word struck Dominic like a physical blow. Detained? Arrested? The thought was foreign, almost surreal. He had always navigated crises with confidence, but this scenario was unprecedented. In all his years of dominance, no one had ever orchestrated a takedown with such precision, such intimate knowledge of his life. The realization that Vanessa, the woman he had trusted above all, was behind this was like a punch to the gut. Every smile, every shared secret, every moment of vulnerability had been weaponized against him. As the morning progressed, Dominic's office became a whirlwind of activity. Investigators arrived. Papers were served and reporters began circling the building, cameras pointed like vultures waiting for the kill. Dominic attempted to speak with the board, to appeal to reason, to argue that the allegations were fabricated, but the carefully laid plans of Vanessa had ensured that he stood isolated. The executives, fearful of becoming collateral damage, maintained their distance. He was alone, a king without a kingdom, facing a legal machinery designed to remove him from power with surgical efficiency. The arrival of the police marked the climax of the betrayal. A uniformed officer, accompanied by two colleagues, entered Dominic's office with a calm yet authoritative presence. "Mr. Kane, you're required to come with us," the lead officer said, producing official documents. Dominic's heart pounded, his mind racing for any way out, any argument, any loophole that could prevent what seemed inevitable. This must be a mistake," he stammered. "I am the CEO of Kane Industries. You can't just—" The officer remained unyielding. "Sir, we have legal authorization. Please cooperate." Dominic's staff watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded. Phones were raised, cameras recorded, whispers filled the office. Dominic felt the walls close in. The empire that had always seemed invincible was collapsing around him in a spectacle of humiliation. He tried to negotiate, to appeal, even to charm, but the words fell flat. Authority, influence, wealth, they all meant nothing in the face of the law now poised to strip him of his freedom. Handcuffs were produced. Dominic's first instinct was to resist, to assert the power he had wielded for so long. But resistance would have been futile, and with a mixture of disbelief and fury, he allowed the officers to secure his wrists. The cold metal bit into his skin, a tangible symbol of the power he had lost in an instant. The sound of the chain link snapping shut echoed ominously, and in that moment, the king of the boardroom became a man in custody, stripped of control, dignity, and security. Vanessa's role in this orchestrated downfall became starkly clear. She had anticipated every move, had ensured that Dominic's options were limited, had coordinated with legal and regulatory bodies with precision. The betrayal was not only personal but public, executed with meticulous understanding of timing, perception, and leverage. Dominic realized with bitter clarity that every shared secret, every intimate detail, every ounce of trust he had given Vanessa had been stored and weaponized against him. As the officers escorted him from his office, cameras flashed relentlessly. Reporters shouted questions. Neighbors watched in astonishment, and social media erupted with live coverage. Dominic's mind raced, trying to process the surreal sequence of events. He had been a master strategist, yet here he was, led to the corridors of his own empire, like a criminal in front of the world. The sensation was disorienting, humbling, and infuriating all at once. The public spectacle was relentless. By the time Dominic was escorted into the police vehicle, a crowd had gathered outside the building. Shouts, questions, and the distant click of camera shutters formed a cacophony of chaos that underscored his fall. Reporters streamed live updates. Dominic Kane taken into custody. Betrayal at the top. The CEO's arrest rocks the business world. From boardroom king to handcuff mogul, a city watches in shock. Inside the vehicle, Dominic was silent. His thoughts swirled. The empire, the deals, the boardroom victories, they all felt distant, irrelevant, like memories of a life that no longer existed. His mind wandered to Vanessa, imagining her composed, smiling, possibly even victorious. Anger surged, but beneath it was a gnawing fear, a realization of the depth of the trap he had fallen into. Every instinct, every skill he had honed over decades, was now being tested in a realm entirely unfamiliar. The raw, unmediated world of legal jeopardy, public scrutiny, and the loss of personal autonomy. The drive to the precinct was tense and silent. Dominic's reputation, once an impenetrable fortress, was now vulnerable to rumor, interpretation, and scandal. Inside, the officers followed procedure, yet Dominic couldn't shake the surreal sense of irony. He had been in thousands of negotiations, faced threats that could topple companies, yet nothing had prepared him for the sting of public humiliation, the helplessness of being in handcuffs, the exposure of vulnerability before a city that had once admired him. Upon arrival at the precinct, Dominic was processed methodically. Fingerprints, photographs, a formal reading of rights. The reality crystallized with every step. This was no boardroom battle, no hostile acquisition, no clever negotiation. It was a full-scale dismantling of power, status, and identity. Every action, every word, every gesture was documented, recorded, and now part of the permanent record of his downfall. In the holding area, Dominic sat alone, handcuffed, surrounded by the ambient noise of other detainees, officers, and ringing phones. He felt the weight of his life in that moment. Not just the empire that was slipping from his grasp, but the trust he had extended, the personal connections he had valued, and the illusions of invincibility that had defined him for so long. Vanessa's betrayal had not only targeted his career, but had penetrated the very core of his existence, exposing vulnerabilities he had never acknowledged, let alone protected. Hours passed. Dominic's thoughts oscillated between anger, disbelief, and a cold, calculating fear. He began to realize that surviving this crisis would require more than intelligence. It would require adaptation, patience, and an unflinching understanding of human motives. Vanessa had demonstrated a mastery of manipulation, strategy, and timing that rivaled his own. She had turned his strengths into weaknesses, his trust into liability, and his empire into the instrument of his public undoing. By nightfall, Dominic Kane, once the untouchable king of boardrooms, had become a cautionary tale. News outlets ran continuous coverage. Social media discussions exploded, and public opinion was already forming judgments. Investors reconsidered their positions. Competitors watched closely, ready to exploit any opportunity. The city, which had once admired his dominance, now marveled at his rapid fall. And Dominic, sitting in the holding cell, could only reflect on the magnitude of the betrayal that had reduced him from power to custody in mere seconds. In that quiet, sterile cell, Dominic made a vow. He would survive this. He would reclaim his life, his empire, and his dignity. But first, he had to navigate the immediate storm, the legal scrutiny, the media circus, the regulatory investigations, and the personal treachery that had orchestrated his downfall. It was a new kind of battle, one with stakes higher than it ever imagined, and Dominic Kane knew that the road to redemption, if it existed, would be fraught with peril, cunning, and strategy unlike anything he had faced before. The king had fallen, but the mind that had built an empire still survived. And somewhere beneath the layers of anger, fear, and humiliation, Dominic Kane began to plan. Not a return to the boardroom yet, but a strategy to understand, confront, and ultimately counter betrayal that had brought him to his knees. Vanessa had won the first round, but the game was far from over. Dominic Kane had never felt so powerless. Handcuffed, humiliated, and under the relentless glare of public scrutiny, he understood in those first hours of custody that the world he had built, the empire, the reputation, the image of invincibility, had been shattered with shocking precision. Vanessa's betrayal had been more than personal. It had been strategic, surgical, and devastating. Every ounce of trust he had placed in her had been exploited, weaponized, and used to orchestrate his downfall. But as he sat alone in a holding cell, Dominic realized one undeniable truth. While he'd been outmaneuvered, he had not been defeated. Not yet. Even in custody, his mind began to work, dissecting every detail of betrayal, analyzing every document, every email, every piece of evidence that had been presented against him. He remembered Vanessa's calm composure, her careful phrasing, the subtle ways she had manipulated perceptions, isolated him from allies, and weaponized his trust. Her genius was evident, but so was her hubris. Dominic knew that the same strategic mind that had orchestrated his fall could be outwitted, yet he approached the challenge with patience, precision, and ruthlessness equal to hers. Hours turned into a long night. Dominic's thoughts were methodical, almost obsessive. He reviewed the sequence of events leading to his arrest, pinpointing exactly where the vulnerabilities had been exploited. He made mental notes. Vanessa's access points, the leaks she had created, the legal mechanisms she had used, the allies she had subtly influenced. Each observation built a map of her strategy, a map that, in his mind, would become the blueprint for his counterattack. By dawn, Dominic had decided that waiting passively was no longer an option. He needed information, leverage, and allies. He requested a meeting with Marcus, his attorney, and outlined a preliminary plan. "We need to understand everything she's done," he said, voice steady despite the fatigue and stress. "Every document, every communication, every person she's manipulated. We can't fight blindly. We need precision." Marcus nodded, recognizing the familiar spark of determination in his client's eyes. "We'll gather everything, Dominic. But you have to understand, this is a high-stakes battle. The media, the regulators, the board, they've all seen the first act of the story. Any misstep could be catastrophic." Dominic listened, but did not waver. He understood the stakes. He had spent his life navigating high-risk scenarios, and this was no different. except the battlefield had shifted from boardrooms and contracts to law offices, courtrooms, and the court of public opinion. The first breakthrough came unexpectedly. One of Dominic's longtime executives, a loyal ally named Claire Sanderson, had quietly started an internal investigation on her own initiative. She had access to internal communications, emails, and audit trails that Vanessa had overlooked or underestimated. Claire's discoveries were startling. Subtle inconsistencies in the documents Vanessa had planted, timestamps that suggested manipulation, and communications between Vanessa and certain legal operatives that implied collusion. Each piece of evidence was a crack in the seemingly impregnable narrative of Dominic's wrongdoing. Armed with these findings, Dominic and Marcus began constructing a defense, meticulously documenting every discrepancy, preparing counterarguments, and mapping out the sequence of events in a way that highlighted Vanessa's orchestration rather than Dominic's supposed malfeasance. This was a painstaking process, requiring intense focus and attention to detail. Every meeting, every document, every email was scrutinized, cross-referenced, and verified. Meanwhile, the media circus continued unabated. News channels ran continuous coverage, and social media erupted with speculation and opinion. Dominic's fall had captured the city's imagination. The once mighty CEO brought low by intimate betrayal, legal action, and financial scandal. But Dominic had learned a critical lesson in public perception. Narratives could be rewritten, and timing was everything. By releasing carefully curated information through his legal team, he began to shift the narrative subtly, casting doubt on the completeness and authenticity of the evidence presented against him, hinting at manipulation by a third party without revealing all details. The public's perception began to shift, slowly but perceptibly. Analysts questioned the speed and coordination of the allegations. Observers noted anomalies in the documents, inconsistencies that could not be ignored. Dominic's reputation, though tarnished, began to regain some measure of credibility. It was a small victory, but in his mind, it was a first step toward full redemption. The next phase required confronting Vanessa directly. Dominic had always prided himself on his strategic thinking, but facing someone who had known him intimately, someone who had anticipated his every move, required a new level of cunning. He arranged, through intermediaries, a private meeting, one where no legal authorities or media could intervene. The goal was not only to confront her, but to understand the extent of her plan and identify leverage points that could neutralize her advantage. When they met, Vanessa greeted him with the same composure and subtle confidence that had characterized her throughout their relationship. Her eyes sparkled with the thrill of having orchestrated such a flawless deception. But Dominic, for the first time since the betrayal, met her gaze without fear. He had reconstructed the timeline, identified the weak points, and was ready to challenge her with the precision that had defined his career. "Dominic," she said, voice calm, almost teasing, "I see you realize what happened." "I've realized everything," Dominic replied evenly. "And I've also realized your mistake." Vanessa's brow arched slightly. "Mistake?" she asked, with a faintly incredulous smile. "I don't see any mistake. I've orchestrated this perfectly. You're exposed. The empire, your reputation, everything, it's crumbling." Dominic leaned forward, voice controlled but sharp. "You underestimated one thing, me. Not my ego, not my power, not my boardroom skills. Me, I've studied every move you made. I know your communications, your alliances, your leaks. And I know that without you, the plan begins to unravel. Your leverage is not absolute." The conversation was tense, electric with the undercurrent of their shared history and the present confrontation. Vanessa, confident yet slightly unsettled, realized that Dominic was no longer the naive partner she had manipulated. He had adapted, recalibrated, and now wielded the same strategic precision that she had thought only she possessed. Through careful negotiation, threats of legal action, and the exposure of her manipulations to mutual acquaintances, Dominic began to turn the tide. He didn't aim to destroy Vanessa entirely. Rather, he sought to neutralize her advantage, reclaim control of his narrative, and secure the evidence that could exonerate him publicly. Slowly, methodically, the pieces began to align. Documents were scrutinized, inconsistencies highlighted, and Vanessa's manipulations exposed in a controlled manner to legal authorities. Weeks passed. Court hearings, regulatory reviews, and private negotiations dominated Dominic's life. The media frenzy continued, but now Dominic was actively participating, shaping the narrative with clarity and authority. Each revelation chipped away at the perception of guilt, revealing a meticulously orchestrated betrayal rather than malfeasance on Dominic's part. Finally, the breakthrough came. A full review of the documents, communications, and regulatory filings confirmed Dominic's innocence in the alleged financial wrongdoing. Vanessa's manipulations, once hidden beneath layers of deception, were brought to light. Legal charges were dismissed. The board publicly supported Dominic, and his reputation began the painstaking process of restoration. Dominic emerged from the ordeal transformed. He had been tested in ways he could never have imagined, stripped of power, publicly humiliated, and betrayed by someone he trusted implicitly. Yet, he survived, adapted, and ultimately reclaimed his position. Vanessa's betrayal had been a lesson in vigilance, trust, and the consequences of underestimating human cunning. He knew that the scars, emotional, professional, and personal, would remain, but so too would the lessons learned, the strategies refined, and the resilience strengthened. As he returned to Kane Industries, the empire he had fought so hard to protect, Dominic walked with a renewed sense of purpose. The boardroom, once a place of pure power, now symbolized not just dominance, but survival, resilience, and the ability to overcome betrayal at the highest level. And while Vanessa's shadow would always linger as a reminder of what had been lost, Dominic Kane had proven that even the most calculated betrayal could not destroy the mind, the will, or the determination of a true boardroom king. In the end, Dominic understood something profound. Power is not just about wealth or position. True power is resilience, strategy, and the ability to navigate the chaos of betrayal and emerge not just intact, but stronger. Vanessa had struck hard, but Dominic had endured, outmaneuvered, and reclaimed not only his empire, but his identity. The lesson was clear. Kings may fall, but the mind that builds an empire can rise again, smarter, sharper, and unyielding. And so, Dominic Kane's journey from boardroom king to police custody and back to reclamation of power became a legend in corporate circles, a story of betrayal, resilience, and ultimate redemption, a reminder that even in the face of the most intimate and devastating treachery, a true strategist can survive, fight back, and triumph.